Hello, my name's Maria Schmitz. Today we're going to talk about the Lonely Londoners. You will learn what the Windrush generation or who the Windrush generation was, and at best we'll talk about the protagonist of the Lonely Londoners. Who was Sam Selvon? Like his characters, Selvon, an author of Indian Trinidadian descent, travelled from Trinidad to England in the 1950s. He's a member of a group of Caribbean writers including V.S. Naipaul, George Lemming, Andrew Salkey, Derek Walcott, who came to London in the 1950s. Written in Creolized English, The Lonely Londoners follows the life of world-weary but kind and intelligent Moses. He meets the newly arrived Galahad at Waterloo Station on a bleak winter's evening. They, the Lonely Londoners, navigate the often unfriendly streets of London, meeting friends, lovers and enemies, and telling their stories of the city. Considered an extraordinary example of late modernist literature, Selvon's novel explores themes of work, leisure, racism, sex, and diaspora. The Lonely Londoners' carefully ordinary observations are true to their period, but the frustrations his characters undergo are sadly not historical. So what's the message of a book that's no longer available, and what's the point? The message of the Lonely Londoners is even more vital today than in Britain of the 1950s, in that, although we live in societies increasingly divided along racial, ideological, and religious lines, we must remember what we still have in common: our humanity. By integrating Caribbean dialect into his narrative, Sam Selvon takes the English novel a step beyond even Dickens, says Sam Yordison. The Lonely Londoners is a milestone in English literature, or at least it is, if we are to believe its author. As he wrote in an essay in 1973, I think I can say without a trace of modesty that I was the first Caribbean writer to explore and use dialect in a full-length novel, where it is used in both narrative and dialogue. The Lonely Londoners is based on the people Selvon met and the stories he heard living in London. It's about being a newcomer to the city as well as being a Caribbean migrant to London. The social realism of the Lonely Londoners fictionalizes the hardship and hustle of Caribbean migrants in a city which saw them as both a threat and exotic sexual thrill. It highlights, for example, the economic deprivation thrust on Caribbean migrants as a result of racist employment and housing practices. The narrator concludes The Lonely Londoners by saying people from around the world are willing to move there and put up with all sorts of hardships just to be at the center of the world. In creating a third-person narrator who uses the same creolized form of English as the characters of the novel, Selvon added a new multiculturalist dimension to the traditional London novel and enhanced the awareness in both readers and writers of a changing London society which could no longer be ignored. The Lonely Londoners was the first novel to portray the chilly welcome given to the early Caribbean immigrants. Helen Habila of The Guardian discovers surprising warmth in a story of race, exile, and survival. The novel, published in 1956, is set in London in the 1950s and concerns the group of Caribbean immigrants known as the Windrush generation, who arrived on a ship of the same name in 1948. A lot of them had fought for Britain in the Second World War, and having found that they couldn't settle back into their small island communities, decided to seek better opportunities in the mother country. Welcomed at first by the British as a source of cheap labour, by the late 50s, as their numbers grew, they became a target of racial hatred and xenophobia, and even hasty anti-immigration legislation in Parliament. The Lonely Londoners was the first novel to take on the task of representing this unrepresented group. Because the immigrants lived on society's fringes, not many people knew of their existence, and those who did, such as workplace foremen or employment office clerks, pretended they did not exist. Moses had somehow become the mentor for everybody, all the new arrivals. So once again, in this book too, he's presented as a character upon whom other immigrants depend, a central figure in a rotating cast of new arrivals, all of whom need guidance. That he hardly has time to settle into his own life before he's required to help others is an indication of how much people rely on one another in the immigrant community. Unfortunately, he himself doesn't seem to have anybody to turn to, and his commitment to helping others is further complicated by the fact that England is becoming increasingly reluctant to welcome immigrants with open arms. As such, Moses not only has to struggle to help his new friends as he works to establish his own life, but he also has to contend with the ignorant and racist society in which he lives, a society that hides its bigotry under a guise of diplomacy. This is, of course, from his perspective, not from an interculturalist's perspective. But on top of that, Selvon's characters are not saints. They're wife-beaters, cheats, weed smokers, skirt chasers. But by boldly using the stereotypes that the British create around black society, he transcends them to create real, multidimensional characters. We soon forget the vices because essentially they're ordinary folks trying to survive in a harsh foreign society that is intent on suppressing them. We share their anguish, their anxieties, their frustrations, and their joys. Above all, we admire their courage as they negotiate streets whose windows carry signs that say, "Keep the water white." The best folk poet the British Caribbean has yet produced, George Lamming. Moses thinks he's got it made. Originally a poor Caribbean immigrant, he's now the proud landlord of a ramshackle house in Shepherd's Bush, London. He has visions of being master of his own domain, writing his memoirs while his trusty sidekick and handyman, Bob, does all the work. But Moses' problems are far from over. Soon a Black Power group take over the basement, headed by the indomitable but very sexy Brenda, and an illegal people-smuggling ring is discovered upstairs. Not to mention harassment from racist police, sheep slaughtering in the backyard, and a Black Panther, the humankind, on the loose. Will Moses' elaborately constructed castle in the air be demolished by these unruly forces? Maybe this book too ends with the old Moses standing on the banks of the Thames, not being any further on than when he arrived.